Welcome back to the Literacy Lunch Break. We are excited to continue to talk about literacy wins in classrooms. Today we have Chelsea Mytko joining us, and we are excited to hear all that she's been doing in her kindergarten classroom this year. Chelsea, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
All right, so before we jump in and talk about all of the wins in your classroom, we always like to start just by getting a little background about yourself. Share anything that you think would be helpful for our listeners to understand really what drove you into education and inspired you to do the work that you're doing in your classroom today.
Sure. Well, about 10 years ago, I began my teaching journey overseas, actually. And before that, I was into coaching. I played basketball through university and I got into coaching, and I got to see how exciting it was when my athletes understood a skill and began to develop that. And I really found a passion for helping kids, but I knew that coaching wasn't what I wanted to do forever. So I began looking into education. And as I got further into it, I went abroad, I had some exposure with that, and I came back and found that kindergarten was where my passion was at. I got to connect with Dr. Janet Mort through Joyful Literacy up here in BC. And we were working with really that vulnerable population and starting to question what was going on and why our students aren't reading. Why is there such a gap here? And it just drove me further into that passion of teaching and really teaching students to read. That's where it all started. Now I have two small children of my own. I have a 3-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. And it's just even more important to me now, having that connection as a mom, to say, wow, it's so important that our students get access to early literacy and really good teaching of early literacy so that they can be successful going through. We want to make that gap so much smaller. We want to bridge that and give success to as many students as possible. So that's kind of my passion background a little bit. And I'm just so grateful that I get to do this job.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I love that you share, that desire to coach and support, and when it clicks and when you see that growth, how inspiring that is and how that can transfer, right, from coaching to teaching. I'm also really excited to talk about that early literacy, right? Because that is so critical. It's this foundation that if we don't build it, just creates so much more work for both teachers, students, parents along the way. So I would love to hear about what has been going on in your classroom. What are some wins that you have found, especially with literacy this year?
Absolutely. This year has been a very special year. In September, we began with a very challenging class. Our needs are high. And I think part of that is still coming off of those COVID years. There's so much stress and anxiety in our families, and some have less access to some of those early literacy opportunities that they had before. But also we just have a very high needs group of students this year. So I was a little concerned at the beginning of the year. And I almost cried yesterday because I put in my data into an Excel chart and I saw the growth. Wow. It's incredible. And I think that really comes down to shifting my focus at the beginning of the year and going into a much more focused scope and sequence, really looking at, okay, what is the research and what do I need for my students? How can I give them the absolute best? And one of those shifts was going sound first with our alphabet. And really, I have to attribute that to the Bridge to Reading program for kindergarten. We shifted into that in September, and the amount of growth I have seen this year just lights a fire in me to continue. I don't want to stop. I want to just keep going with these students because it's amazing to see. So definitely really diving into a good scope and sequence, following it daily, getting into a routine with our students where they feel comfortable and confident has made a huge change.
I love just listening to you because, I was a former teacher and my passion was always to work in districts that had high needs, right? Because we know across all districts need high quality educators, but we know that, there are some challenges with those districts that have higher needs. And sometimes you would see this mindset of like, oh, this class this year, right? This class. And you almost go into it thinking like, I don't know. It's going to just be a rough year. This is the hand that we were dealt versus, okay, it's such a mindset shift of, okay, yes, I'm looking and I recognize there are some factors that have a role in the students that are going to be in my classroom this year. Across the board, we're seeing the impact on COVID with the less opportunities for language or socialization, but that mindset of, okay, so what am I going to do about it? And what does the research say? Not that these
Exactly.
students can't have access to these skills or there's something blocking them, but more than ever, that's why it's so critical and so important that we're following the research, we're looking at what works best, and then we're looking at data, and that's driving our instruction as well, because that may need to be adjusted, of course, but we're giving them that
Absolutely.
access.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I heard you say you're excited about the data and you want to keep going. Again, something that when you said that, I was like, yep, and that's probably how students feel, right? They're feeling that
Mhm.
success, and even if this is hard work for them, they're feeling successful and they want to keep going because they understand that they're learning. The skills in kindergarten is so exciting when they start to understand how sounds connect to print, and then they have access for reading and spelling. But I would love to hear a little bit more about the success with your data. What are you noticing? What is the difference maybe from previous years to this year?
So for previous years, I've always seen like we've done quite well getting our students to have access to the alphabet and all of that. But building on your alphabet practice so that you're immediately going into words and you're immediately going into context for them. So
Mm.
I have students who are going, I can read. Like I can read, and that light bulb goes on, and it's like, yes, you can. So being able to say, okay, these are the letters, these are the sounds that they're making, but immediately once you have three letters that can come together, you're making a word. And
Yes.
then you're using that word in sentences. You're writing that word on a whiteboard. You're creating this environment where students realize this, it makes sense. There's a reason why we're learning these alphabet letters. It's not just the alphabet chart on the wall.
Yes.
It connects to that reading. And this last week, we've had so many students realizing that, wow, I can put the word the on the top and then I can add another word and we can make this pyramid and I can read the whole thing. So that's, yeah, just being able to put it into context for students and show them the meaning, show them the why behind everything, because then they see it's worth it.
Yeah, that's really powerful. As I think about that as well, and then we'll kind of move in because you're talking quite a bit about classroom community, and I think that's so critical, especially always important, but especially with our youngest learners, and coming into kindergarten and ensuring that this environment of learning is giving them the skills that they need access to, but also a classroom that makes them feel comfortable, that makes them feel confident at taking risks, and is enjoying. You mentioned joyful literacy, enjoying the process of learning to read. And I think sometimes there's this big, I see this all the time, on social media and across education is, oh, that's not developmentally appropriate for our students. They're too young. What happened to play? And there absolutely is a place for play. But I'm
Mhm.
always curious about that developmentally appropriate. I'm like, where's the research that says,
Yes.
access to understanding that alphabet that we're having them sing early on in pre-K, or even before that, access to that to understand how that connects to sounds and decoding and encoding. So I'm kind of getting off on a tangent here, but that is, again, access to skills that are absolutely critical to their success. And as we think about kindergarten and that environment, I think that's something that is so critical and so important, is to create this environment that is joyful, that learning is joyful. Having access to print is joyful. So how do you create that community in your classroom if we do have some listeners that really
Mhm.
have been, in pre-K, kindergarten, and are recognizing absolutely there's been a shift in the way kindergarten looks, but it maybe doesn't have to be so different than we think it does.
Absolutely. I would say there's kind of three things I would touch on with that. The first being before you can get into any of that academic, regardless of whatever it is, you have to build the relationships in the
Yeah.
classroom. As you mentioned at the beginning, students are coming from various backgrounds. They're coming from homes that may have anxiety, or maybe they're coming from a background where they haven't had any exposure to early literacy or math or whatever it is. So building that relationship with each other, getting to know each other's names, because names are so important to us. So having names up, getting to know them, doing activities with that, and then looking at the class culture of how do we want to feel when we come into our classrooms, and what do we need from each other in order to feel that way? Having those early discussions, celebrating each other's differences. And then as we talk, kind of connecting with the data, we actually do a lot of, hey, understand our strengths and our weaknesses. So
Mm-hmm.
looking at Bobby, oh my goodness, he came in knowing all of his alphabet letters. That's fantastic. Way to go, Bobby. Johnny over here came in with none. But man, when that kid learns a letter or makes some progress, we are all celebrating. We are
Yes.
cheering. We are connecting with that student, regardless of whether they know something and the other student doesn't. We're always celebrating any kind of growth for all of our students. So that's a really big one for me, is not hiding the data, not hiding the fact that some students are stronger than others coming in, but just celebrating with each other whenever we have a win, whatever
Yeah.
that looks
I feel like that's like, as we talk about growth mindset, right? Building
like.
that growth mindset within your classroom of, it's not a fixed set of skills. And maybe you already
Mhm.
know this, maybe you don't, but we're all going to be learning and growing this year. And,
Yeah.
that's so critical to growth. So I love that.
Absolutely. And then another thing I would say is practice. So when we look at our students and we're explicitly teaching, we've got all of it down. If we don't give them enough practice, they don't have the
Mhm.
confidence to continue trying and to risk a little bit with their learning. So giving all of the classroom time to practice is really important. So what I talk about is giving extra doses. So we have our whole group instruction, which I think is so critical, that we're giving them all a chance to learn and all a chance to be on the same page, and then sprinkling in those extra doses, whether it's small group practice or individual, or even things like lining up. In kindergarten, we do so much of that, and in primary in general, but you have to line up to wash your hands, you have to line up to go to the gym, whatever it is. We can absolutely sprinkle in some literacy there.
Yes.
So I could take one of my Haggerty phonemic awareness routines and I can say, okay, as you're lining up, b at bat, off you go to wash your hands. Or we can be singing down by the bay and
Mhm.
filling in rhyming words as they're washing. So any chance that they can have to practice in a very relaxed way, they're going to feel more confident. It's not this sit down testing block. It's just in the classroom all the time. It's like the air we breathe. So I think that really helps to give them access and to build that confidence as well.
I love that. And I think it's so critical to weave that throughout the day as well, because it isn't in a box, and literacy isn't in a box. And that's always what we say, right? It's not, oh, here's my phonemic awareness. Oh, now my font. And then we're done. I
Mm-hmm.
remember when I would model in kindergarten classrooms, I have them say they would be dismissed based on the number of syllables in their names, right? Their
Yes.
names are special. So if your name has, and then also as a teacher, then you're recognizing, well, some kiddos are still not understanding this concept or don't really know, how many syllables are in their name. So love
So
that you shared those transitions.
I mean, I could go on a tangent about that too with assessment, but that's just another form of assessment, right? To be able to
Mhm.
do these, and oh, I have my little thing, I'm marking it off too. But then the last thing kind of I want to talk about as far as building that community and that confidence with literacy is, and I'm going to quote Miss Frizzle here, but on my wall, I have the, take chances, make mistakes, get messy. I talk about that with students all the time, but play and get messy with the students,
Mhm.
because that's where they're excited, they're engaged, and they're not afraid to make mistakes.
Yes.
If they've got their hands in shaving cream on the table and they're building a word, they're not worried about that. They're just going to wipe it off. It's a non permanent surface, which gives them the confidence to try. So, being able to do printing like that, playing with Play Doh, bringing out the blocks and making some things that they can then topple over. There's so many ways that we can integrate play and what we want in a kindergarten, pre K, grade one classroom. and still get that learning in and still
Mhm.
follow the scope and sequence, still follow the explicit teaching that we've done. Any practice we're doing in a playful way is still based on what we have explicitly taught. So they have the confidence to try it. So I just think it's so important to still give them the opportunity to be kids and play while following the research.
I absolutely love that you shared that. In the district I used to be a literacy coach in, we actually, with kindergarten, because our kindergarten was moving from half day to full day, and it's a big shift of kindergarten used to be play. They used to come and play is good, as you just said, but it was really more of that socialization. And then things did start to change. But again, I think because we recognize how important it is to tune students into these foundational skills early on. And we read the book Purposeful Play. And it was such a meaningful book because, again, absolutely, students should be playing, but we have to be able to understand that part of play is what is imitating,
Mm-hmm.
astronauts or chefs or athletes and teachers and writing and reading. And so when we offer that opportunity to do that work, right, of like, and I love the way you said, a non-permanent surface, we're just playing with shaving cream, we're just doing this, we're just doing that, um, is absolutely critical. And so I just love that you shared that. And I'm really hopeful if we have some listeners that are working in those, early childhood grades, or pre-K, kinder, first grade, really starting to take a different look on and what we mean, by play. If we have a center and we're, playing restaurant, we can write a menu and students are then, right, what are they doing? They're taking what they've learned, right? So it's that balance of this is the research and this is the art of teaching. And we really should be intertwining and working they should work together, right? It's not one or the other.
Not at all. And it can happen so early. My daughter's 3 now, but when she was 18 months old, I would give her notepads and access to crayons and pens and things. She was writing grocery lists at
Yes.
18 months. And she
Love
had no
that.
idea, but she was talking to me and pretending to write a
Hmm.
grocery list because she watched me do it. And that's
Hmm.
happening in our families. Why not continue that at school? We model things all the time. Give them access to some markers and some papers while they're playing in the kitchen, and they will want to build menus. They will want to do that because they've seen it. They're watching and they're always imitating. So many ways to do that pre-K, so many ways to do that when they're just tiny tots and they're getting that exposure.
I love that. Well, Chelsea, I love talking to you, but we try to keep the episode short because we know how busy teachers are. But one question I do always like to wrap up with is if you have, any educators listening to this podcast and maybe starting to rethink some things. But again, this really is about wins, right? There's a lot that's coming at us as educators and trying to make some shifts. You've celebrated some wins and shared some wins. Is there one piece of advice if somebody's just starting this journey to start to maybe revisit or rethink some instructional decisions or even classroom environment that you would like to give to our listeners?
That's a really great question. There's so many things that I've learned over the last couple of years. The biggest thing for me is really grounding yourself in the research. Understand what it is that you are going to be teaching your students. Understand it yourself before you kind of go into it. That is so, so critical to have the why you're doing it. And then integrate the fun, integrate the play. Don't lose track of that.
Love
So
that.
to me, that's kind of twofold, but really have a good grasp of research. And if you don't have a good program, then you need to figure it out. You need to be able to find something that's going to work for you. I I would say my bridge to reading journey this year has been amazing. So that's my kind of thing. But ground yourself in the research and don't forget to have fun with your students and
I
enjoy
love
the journey
that.
as well.
That's a great way to wrap it up. And I just want to add on, you said, if you don't have a curriculum there, and if you're a listener and you're, trying to find that out, again, in my last district, teachers were creating their own curriculum. We didn't have anything. That was kind of, that was that stage of education. What we do know is just make sure there is no one specific scope and sequence. Just make sure as you're looking at your scope and sequence, it's, you're starting with least complex and you're moving to most complex skills. And that's the most important piece when we think about a scope and sequence. But as you said, then we can't forget about the other pieces and bringing in that play and making this fun and creating that environment that this is exciting work is so great. Chelsea, thank you so much for being our guest today. And thank you for all that you do in your classroom as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for our upcoming episodes where we explore literacy topics in a snack-sized, easily digestible format.